Welcome to part 2 of the Ultimate Turbo Miata guide, and today we are going to talk about turbochargers, as you can see right here. I have 3 options lined up here, but we are going to talk about a lot more since I have been able to experience quite a few of them and I know what you should use and what you shouldn't use. Starting with the lowest cost options. If you are building a turbo manifold yourself, you have the choice of flanges. Many people choose the TD04 turbo, which is a valid choice because those TD04 turbos, especially the 13T, which is the one that comes off the Subaru WRXs, are quite responsive because they are very small. Those are a good option if you don't have much money to spend. Turbos are cheap and the best source to get them is pretty much Chinese knockoffs from Max Speeding Roads, for example. But they have one big problem and one big flaw, and that is that the top end is not too good. They have full power at around 3000 RPM, so this is really good for such a cheap option. But they fall off around 6000 RPM quite heavily, so this makes them for higher power builds quite bad because as the exhaust side is so restrictive, they are creating a lot of exhaust back pressure, which is in turn creating a lot of heat and therefore a lot of exhaust gas temperature. So I wouldn't really recommend them for track days as well as longer full throttle driving. For short pulls they're pretty much okay, or for lower boost levels up to like 10 psi, but if you go over that, like 14-15 psi, I wouldn't really suggest running them longer periods of time at full throttle because that will hurt them and they will not thank you for that. For this, the better option would be a T25 Turbo, such as a GT28 knockoff or copy. Those spool quite a bit slower, so around 42 to 4500 would be maximum power, which is quite slow, I know. And this is pretty much the problem about these. But the good thing is that they provide quite a bit more top-end power. You will be able to run around 300 horsepower at max, where the TD04 13T is limited to about 240 at the crank. So if you want a bit more power, the GT28 knockoff would be your better bet. The most popular option though, because most of the cast cheap manifolds are only available with a T3 flange, would be this bad boy right here. It looks very big in the video because the distance between the compressor and the actual like volute, which is this thing, is quite big, which makes the turbo very big, but trust me, it's not actually that big. This is a T3 T4 unit, which may be confusing to some people because there are a lot of T3 T4 units, but this is a special one. This is a 50 trim, which is the compressor wheel size, so it's the smallest one that you can get of the T3 T4 units. It's still quite big, but in the same kind of neighborhood as these two GT28s, so it's not too bad. The only problem is that the exhaust side or exhaust wheel is kind of big, but because of this you have a relatively small exhaust housing. This is a 0.48 AR exhaust housing, so the smallest one you can get for those turbos, which makes the turbo quite responsive in that case. Of course, it's going to be somewhat lazier than a smaller unit like one of those, or even maybe a knockoff GT28, but this is an option that fits natively on a T3 manifold and that will also support 300 horsepower without any problems. And yeah, it just works and is probably the best option if you're going to use a AliExpress or eBay turbo manifold. And yeah, You can also compare the exhaust housing of this to a GT28.64 housing, which is bigger. So you can see it's quite small, and the smaller this housing is, the better is the spool. Obviously, it's kind of hindered in that the wheel size is kind of big, so they are a bit heavier and a bit harder to spool, but this is why the exhaust housing is smaller. Those would be the options for your low budget builds. If you can spend some more money, like, I don't know, 500 bucks more or something like that, you will be able to afford something like this, or something like a GT25 maybe you have looked at that. But there are some better alternatives now, because the GT25 is very outdated now. It has been like 8-10 years since they have been released, and many people still recommend the GT25 for their good response, which is true, but there are better options now. Especially the new GBC lineup from Garrett. They make GBC turbos for cars from 200 horsepower up to 350 horsepower, and the GBC 17250 or 2300 are pretty much some of the best turbos with the best response that you can get right now. Even the 17250 is able to hold power all the way through the rev range, which the TD04 can't, and neither can the GT2560, for example. The GT2560 will also fall kind of on its face up top, because those turbos are just very small, and due to the modern aerodynamics, the billet wheel of the GBC series, and also the modern aerodynamics of the turbine, they can hold power even up top. You can go up to 350 horsepower on those bigger units. The GBC 17250 will make around 240 crank horsepower. The 2300 will make around 270 to 280, and the 22350 will make around 330 crank horsepower. So for a stock engine, that's pretty much your best option, no matter what. If you want any higher power, I would suggest something like this. This is kind of a cheaper option. It's a Pulsar GTX 2860, which will be able to handle around 400 horsepower. It's ball bearing, but is a bit cheaper than, or quite a bit cheaper than, the Garrett options. So those are around 600 euros or 600 bucks. And they are also very good, but turbo response is going to be somewhat worse than with the GBC lineup, where the GBCs spool at 3000 RPM or even sooner. They have their full power depending on what size you choose. Those ones are going to take around 1000 RPM longer at least. From my experience, they have their full boost at around 4000 RPM on a 1.6 or 1.8. 1.8 is going to be a bit quicker, but as I said, 4000 RPM around that. The 2871R, which is a bit bigger than the 60R, is going to make boost a bit later, but also has a bit more top end. This is going to make around 470 to 480 horsepower, and which is about 80 or 70, 80 more than the other one. If you have even more budget to spend, you obviously could go for a genuine Garrett unit, but there's one trick that I would suggest you'd go for if you have the cash to spend, is you go for a Pulsar G25 550 or a G25 660, depending on your power goals. They are quite a good copy of the Garrett units, and the G25 lineup is also quite a bit better than the GT28 lineup, so they will make more power. The 550 is going to make around 500 crank horsepower and the 660 around 600 or something like that. But they are also even more responsive than those, so they will make full power at about 3400 to 3600 RPM. So about 400 RPM earlier than these, and the genuine Garrett units will be even better, but not by much. They will be better, of course, when it comes to reliability and stuff, and durability in general. So for racing applications and stuff, they might be your better bet. Also, you can take a look at the Borg Warner EFR options, but those are more compared to the genuine Garretts because they are quite expensive as well. The 6258 can also handle about 450 to 460 horsepower to the crank, and the 6758, which will be the 25660 equivalent, can handle around 550 horsepower at the crank. So they are a bit weaker but also a bit cheaper than the genuine Garrett units. If you want to go even higher, which I wouldn't really recommend because on an MX-5 500 horsepower is really a lot, but if you want to go for like a really high horsepower build, you have the options of a G30 770, which is really responsive, because I'd even say it would be as responsive as this one, so this GTX 2871R. So I think they should have full spool at around 4500 RPM, but they can make up to 700 horsepower at the crank. The other option, if you want to go for the max, would be the G30 900, which would make around 800 horsepower at max, but that's also going to be quite a lot to achieve on an MX-5 engine. So yeah, maybe the G30 770 or even the G25 660 are kind of the limit that you should go for. So concluding everything and going over everything again in a kind of a short conclusion. If you have a smaller budget, go for either, if you're gonna build a setup with a cast T3 manifold, go for the T3 T4 unit, or if you build your manifold yourself, you want very good response for TDO4 13T. If you don't want that good response but more top end, go for a GT28 knockoff. If you have a bit more to spend, Garrett GBC, and then depending on your power goal, select the correct turbo. Above that, G25 550 or 660 if you can spend the cash, or if you have a bit less money to spend, so somewhere in between the GT28 knockoff and a G25 would be something like this, the GTX 2860R. I've seen on a 2867R making over 400 wheel horsepower, so they are also quite good and they can handle a lot of power. Yeah, if you have any questions about turbochargers or in general MX-5 turbo conversions, just let us know in the comments. And yeah, stay tuned for the next video where we're gonna talk about exhaust systems, downpipes, what mufflers to use, what cats to use, and what size diameter of exhaust to use. Yeah, stay tuned for that. I wish you a nice day. Goodbye.